Okay, you just give me the thumbs up. All righty. Okay. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for our next speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathy Evans, and my great friend. And she comes to us from Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia. And Kathy and I became friends in graduate school at the University of Tennessee a few years ago. And Kathy had come to Tennessee from Mississippi and a family of conservative Southern Baptists. This church and family was one that held no place for the notion that someone could be both Christian and gay. So over the years, Kathy struggled with her identity from the past and her emerging authentic identity. Eventually, Kathy was able to come out to herself, and then her friends, who were very supportive and thrilled that she was finally able to be her true self. Later, she got the courage to come out to her family, who, quite frankly, were not anywhere near thrilled, but she continues to show up for those courageous conversations. And along the way, Kathy was introduced to restorative justice, a framework for repairing harm and transforming conflict. Recently, she even wrote a book on restorative education. As we talked the other night, however, about her accomplishments, more than the book, she was most proud of her efforts at promoting change at her university. 10 years prior to her arrival at Eastern Mennonite University, a staff member was fired because she married her longtime partner. Same-sex partner, excuse me. Since then, Kathy's been instrumental in changing the hiring policy that now protects faculty regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Additionally, just recently, Kathy and a few of her BA, you know what that means if I say that? Her strong-willed, awesome colleagues and students went around the university and literally tore down bathroom signs and put up new signs to create gender-neutral bathrooms around the campus. In addition to this work at her university, Kathy continues to promote restorative justice in school settings around Virginia and the nation. So without further ado, Dr. Kathy Evans.
Hi, y'all. I'm very glad to be here today. Wow, and I'm looking out and I'm seeing so many amazing faces, and I'm excited to be here. So before we start, though, there's a few things I need to say. One, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge that the land that we're standing on was once inhabited by 13 different tribes, including, but not limited to, the Arapaho, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Sioux, the Shoshone, and the Ute. And I realize that just an acknowledgement falls devastatingly short of the real work that needs to happen to repair the harm that's caused by a long history of colonization. I also want to acknowledge the paradox of speaking about restorative justice within the context of that history. The history of colonization in the U.S. has yet to be acknowledged fully and addressed, and the harm has yet to be fully repaired. And so it's with just a bit of tension that I want to talk about the importance of restorative justice in our social justice work. The tension that I feel arises from the fact that these are not my ideas. These are not white people's ideas. In particular, we are indebted to the humility and grace offered by indigenous people across North America who have kept the wonder of these ideas, circle processes, and dialogue alive throughout generations, even though they were threatened with genocide. And while I indeed represent the people who led in that colonization, I hope that our time today honors their traditions, their teaching, and further opens our hearts to still learn more fully from their wisdom. Secondly, I'd like to honor the educators in the room. Those of you that work tirelessly every day to commit yourselves on a daily basis to the well-being of students and your colleagues. I'm grateful for that you're here, and I hope that we'll find a way to learn from and with each other this morning. So, if you are a teacher, an educator, a school counselor, an administrator, could I get you to just raise your hand or stand up, one or the other? Yeah, Can we give them a big, huge round of applause? A couple of just disclaimers before I start. Almost everything I know about practicing restorative justice in education, I learned from teachers. I have fun ideas, and I really love restorative justice as a framework. But when it comes down to what it looks like every day in schools and classrooms, I learned that from educators who are brilliantly doing the work every day. So I just want to say thank you, and let's keep doing that work together. Secondly, I want to make an assumption that we are all, myself included, doing the best we can. In general, we know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. If we knew better, we would do better. And so let's keep learning so that we can keep improving, right? And that's true of our social justice work. It's also true of education in general. It's also true of restorative justice. And so I just want to lay out those caveats as a way to say, in no way do I ever want to criticize educational contexts. Our previous speaker talked about the inequities, the social justice, the structural inequities that occur in schools and classrooms on a daily basis for Black and brown students. Those same inequities occur for LGBTQIAP+ students. Those same inequities occur, not the same, similar inequities occur for students who come from economically disprivileged backgrounds. And so as a way to do restorative justice, I think we have to focus on that J, the restorative justice. So let me back up a little bit, and I'll talk to you just a bit about restorative justice's foundations. In the I'm a walker. I'll try to make myself stay close to the mic. In the 1970s, the first Western application of restorative justice occurred. And I want to say it that way because remember, these ideas have been practiced within indigenous communities for generations and centuries, right? This is not new. But the first Western application happened in Canada. A young man who'd been accused of vandalizing some property was met, instead of with a punitive measure, was met with an opportunity to repair the harm. And so he did. And they reestablished some community connections between the young man and his neighborhood. What ensued was not just a repair of the damage that had happened, that he had caused, but a repair of the relationships. And thus started what was called victim-offender conferencing. And that lasted and is still going on today. Howard Zehr, who was front runner in that work, defined restorative justice as a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address the harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. Now, if we had all day, I would say what stands out to you in this definition, but I'll tell you what stands out to me. This notion of harms, needs, and obligations really stands out to me. So I love dialogue and I love collaborative communication because it opens up space for us to talk about really difficult conversations. So our theme on courageous conversations really speaks to my heart. We need to have those courageous conversations. And when harm happens, we need to acknowledge that harm and realize that harm creates needs. And people are obligated to come back and repair that harm in order to meet those needs. So that's Howard's definition, and it still lives in the criminal justice system all over the place. In 1994, is that right? 1998, something. Lorraine and Judy wrote the Little Book of Restorative Discipline in Schools. And they define restorative justice as promoting values and principles that use inclusive, collaborative approaches for being in community. These approaches validate the experiences and needs of everyone in the community, particularly those who've been marginalized, oppressed, and harmed. These approaches allow us to act and respond in ways that are healing rather than alienating or coercive. That was the first book that I ever read on restorative justice. I was working on my doctorate in educational psychology, and I was looking specifically at disproportional school discipline and the over-suspending of students. And I was like, whoa, we got to do something different. So I kept telling teachers, quit suspending kids. And they would say, okay, but what are we supposed to do instead? And I would say, I don't know. And so I started this quest, looking for what do we do instead of suspending students when they act out? What are the alternatives? And I found restorative justice. I could tell you the fun, long story about that, how I found restorative justice, but we'll save that for another day. Let's see. So anyway, so when I came to restorative justice first, I really was thinking of it as an alternative to suspensions and expulsions. The more I dug into it, and getting a PhD in educational psychology really helped me dig into some ideas deeper, I realized this can't just be something that we do instead of suspending kids. This has to be a holistic way to transform our schools into vibrant places of learning for everybody. Let me say that again. Restorative justice has to be an approach to creating vibrant learning opportunities for all of our students, each specific, every one. And so in order to do that, we have to think more than just about disciplinary practices. We have to think about harms, needs, and obligations. So, I've been at Eastern Mennonite University now for 7 full years, and I love my work there. It has been challenging, as Janelle alluded to, being a primarily Christian university within a southern context. Wasn't a lot of openness to LGBTQIAP plus folks, queer folks like myself. My first 2 years there, I was in the closet completely, scared to death that I would lose my job if I came out, and yet very committed to doing the restorative justice work, because this is what I wanted to do for my life. And so over the course of the last 7 years, we have, like Janelle mentioned, changed the policy. And I want to say that I didn't lead in that effort. Like, I was part of that effort, but that effort started 20, 30 years before I got there, with people pushing on, pushing on, pushing on, pushing on unjust structures. And I happened to get there at a beautiful time when we were able to make that shift. And we're not done yet. Like I said, we can change the hiring policy, and now I can be out. But it was just last year that we changed those bathroom signs, right? And they're not all over the campus. They're only in parts of the campus. And we still have lots of work to do. But I feel that a framework of restorative justice and collaborative communication and dialogue can help us get to those places together in ways that move us forward as a university towards more justice and more equity. So we've started a restorative justice and education graduate program, which is one of the funnest things that I've been able to do. And I'm really thrilled to be teaching in that program. So we take graduate education and we put a restorative justice lens to it. I want to back up, though, and realize that in some places, restorative justice has been applied in ways that didn't promote justice and equity. I realize that, when it's just an approach to change students' behavior or just an alternative to suspensions and expulsions, that we can do a lot of things that keep kids out of suspension, but that don't really change the outcomes, the learning environment, right? And that's happened in a lot of places, and I know that. And so I think for some people there's a bad taste in their mouth when they hear the word restorative justice, because they think, oh, that just means that bullying doesn't get addressed, or it means that, we don't address misbehavior, or that we don't, address inequities. And I think that it has been applied in that way in a lot of ways. But in a lot of spaces, it's being applied with amazing commitment to justice. I want to just name a couple. But before I do, I have this really cool picture I want to show you. But I can't get this to there we go. Did it show up? No. There. So there we have 3 tomato plants. The one on the left has lots of green leaves and some green tomatoes that look like they are ripening in really good places. The one in the middle has some red tomatoes, but the leaves and the vines look pretty sad, right? And then the one on the right, the whole thing looks really disgusting and sad. If I were to have these tomato plants growing in my yard, and they looked like this, would I look at the one on the right and say, well, that just must have been a bad plant? No, what would I ask? What would I say? Yeah, dang, that thing needs some water, right? Like, oh my goodness, I gotta water my tomato plants. I'm a horrible gardener. And I was talking to somebody about the one in the middle, and she actually is a gardener, and I'm really not. And she said, oh, that one needs some, and she named some chemical that you should throw in the dirt, some support. But there are things like that. Like, we know that if a tomato plant isn't thriving, it's not because it's a bad plant, it's because we're doing something or not doing something. We haven't added, there's a need there that's not being met. And yet with our students all the time, and some of you may feel this, if they're acting out in ways that teachers would like for them to not act in, well, you say that's a bad kid. Or if my parents are treating me in a way that's icky, oh, they're bad. No, they're not bad parents. They have needs, they have harms, they have backgrounds. And part of this whole thing is recognizing our shared humanity. So I want to say that restorative justice is grounded in this notion that we all come to relationships with various needs and various harms and various backgrounds. And part of the work that we do together is repairing those harms and meeting those needs where possible. I realized what was happening. I was changing this one and not this one. Good, So back to, and this is the slide about the work at EMU. So EMU started a master's program. There's the website. It's cool. So I want to name that one organization here in Wyoming that I think is doing restorative justice from this holistic approach is the Wyoming Restorative Justice Center. Martha, will you wave? That's Martha Dole over there. So everybody say hi, Martha. Okay, so Martha works tirelessly in the state of Wyoming to promote restorative justice, both in education and in the criminal justice system. And so, I think it's important that if you're going to connect with people that are doing good work, that you know who those people are. So I just want to bring attention to Martha and the Wyoming Restorative Justice Council, and also just say, after the session, this is a shameless plug, if you want a copy of the Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education, she has a few copies. There it is. And so another organization that's doing really great restorative justice work that I lean into a lot, that I rely on a lot, is the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJOY. Has anybody heard of RJOY? Ish. Okay, so Restorative Justice Oakland Youth is working in the city of Oakland, and they've been doing not only alternatives to suspensions, but also working to change cultures and climates in schools. And so when we got ready to write the Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education, we wanted to define it real broadly like that. And so we define restorative justice in education as facilitating learning communities that nurture the capacity of people to engage with one another and their environment in a manner that supports and respects the inherent dignity and worth of all. So, back to my story. Learning about restorative justice has been incredibly personally transformative for me, and has impacted not only the way that I approach conflict and harm, but the way that I approach relationships in general. And so for me, restorative justice isn't a thing we do. It's a lens, it's a way of being, it's a compass to point me in a good direction. And so I want to talk a little bit about restorative justice as this very holistic approach. So first of all, restorative justice has a commitment to address student needs, not simply their behavior. The idea that we have needs, and right here it says student needs, and I talk about student needs a lot, but let's just be clear. Anybody in a learning environment has needs. So what are the needs of your teachers? What are the needs of the administrators? What are the needs of parents and caregivers? Like, everybody in an educational environment has specific needs that they bring to a setting. And how are we meeting and addressing those needs? Sullivan and Tift say that we develop our potentialities as human beings, and we enhance our collective well-being when our needs are respected, expressed, listened to, defined with care, and ultimately met. And I know that there are some times when needs can't be ultimately met. Like, I get that there are needs that just aren't going to be met today and in a school environment. I want to be realistic about that. But teachers, you can go a long way by just acknowledging that those needs are there, by listening deeply to students as they express what those needs are. Even if you can't ultimately meet that need, you can go a long way by demonstrating that you honor what those needs are. This is rooted in what we know about educational theory. So in grad school, I studied motivation theory as an educational psychologist. Everything we know about motivation says that at our core, there are basic human needs that we have. And among them, and Howard identifies those in his book as well, are autonomy, a need to have some sense of say over your life, a sense of order, like the world makes sense, relatedness, like I got people that I know care for me and love me and support me. If those needs aren't met, according to Maslow, according to motivation theory, according to like everybody I know, very few people are going to thrive. We're just not going to do well. I'm not going to do well if I don't have my people around me. Got to have my peeps, right? And you know who your peeps are. And if they're not there and you don't have good, healthy relationships, we're not going to do well in algebra. We're not going to care about algebra, right? So, like, I think part of that is meeting those needs. It's not the only thing, but I do think it's a huge part. So, yeah, those are some of the people that have talked about this. There's lots that talk about underlying needs. Another principle, I think, of restorative justice as a holistic approach is this idea that we view conflict as a learning opportunity. The Mennonites don't like conflict, and so one of the things that I've had to get used to hanging out with Mennonites is this whole notion of conflict avoidance. La, 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 right? And so, like, rather avoid the conflict than address it. And yet, conflict is an essential part of relationships. I don't know any really strong, healthy relationships that haven't experienced a great deal of conflict, because it's in the conflict that we learn how to love one another better, how to care for one another better. And so as we talk about courageous conversations, conflict has to be part of that. Sometimes, not always, sometimes we run from conflict because we don't know how to deal with it. And what restorative justice does is, I think, help us learn what to do with conflict and how to address it in ways that are helpful and not harmful. So that's another principle. I won't belabor that one. Now, I'll just show you this little picture here, and then we're going to talk about justice a whole lot. So when we talk about restorative justice in education, I want to start in the middle here. Do you see that in the very middle where it says people are worthy and relational? If you don't believe that, I don't care how many circle trainings you go to, how much you know about restorative justice. It's not going to be restorative justice if at our core we don't believe that we are all worthy and relational. It's just a thing. Well, think for a moment. Who are the people in your life that treat you like you are worthy? Who are those people, right? Don't you want to hang out with those people more, right? Who are the people who know that, like, you have value and dignity? That's a core principle of restorative justice in education. No amount of alternatives to discipline can replace the belief that every one of the people in my building, my school, every student in my classroom has worth and dignity and deserves respect. I want to talk just a little bit about mutual concern. Mutual concern is this notion that what happens to you impacts me, and what happens to me impacts you. So therefore, I'm concerned about your life because I know that we are connected. The African culture would call this Ubuntu. Like, we are because we are. I can't exist without you. You can't exist without me. And so this mutual concern idea means that I can't anymore toss away somebody that gets under my skin and assume that they don't matter, because they do matter, and I need every person. So the person who looks at me and says, yeah, I don't believe in restorative justice, I need that person in my life. I need that person to remind me of where the pitfalls are. The person who says, I hate gay people, I need that person in my life to remind me that I used to say that too, right? That, like, I need to be humble in my approach to advocating. I need to realize that not everybody grows up in the same environment, learning the same openness. And so one of the things that we've talked about this week so much is assuming the best in people. And I heard that a lot yesterday. Let our first assumption be that the other person has value and worth, assuming their best. So that's the pieces around the edge, the respect, the dignity, the mutual concern. And then our model has three big components: building and maintaining healthy relationships, repairing harm and transforming conflict, and creating just and equitable learning environments. We're going to camp out in that orange circle because today in a social justice conference, I want to assume that we can't do good restorative justice work if we're not talking about justice. Can I say that again? We cannot do good restorative justice work if we're not talking about justice. So, we already did those things. Gosh, how did that happen? Oh, do you know what? I'm going to do this here. Actually, I really want to do this with you. Can we come here? So one of the things, I'm going to back up. I forgot that I included this, and I really want to talk about it. So one of the things that restorative justice says is that there's accountability with support. So one of the misnomers of restorative justice is, oh, it's just going to be soft. You're going to put kids in a room, and they're going to sing Kumbaya, and then nobody's held accountable. And that's not true. There is an accountability, but it's an accountability with support. Everybody's leaving. Where's everybody going? So, all right, so this is the relationship window. Over on the left, we have expectations for being human, like high expectations, low expectations, and on the bottom we have support. In many situations, this is not working. There we go. We ignore people. So the students are the people in our lives that we don't want to mess with. We just don't expect anything out of them, and we don't provide any support. Or we can feel sorry for them, and we can hold still low expectations, but offer a lot of support and feel sorry for them. We can do things to people. We can get angry with them and lash out and scream at them or punish them or, whatever. But what restorative justice focuses on is doing things with people, so making decisions together, working collaboratively to move things forward. And so I just want to throw that out there as a way to say, like, when we're talking about doing restorative justice work and when we're talking about promoting justice work, I want to make sure that we're talking about how we do that with one another. Can I critique the social justice work just a little bit? So sometimes in the social justice work, it's about loud voices pushing an agenda on others. And I know that sometimes we need to be loud. And I know that sometimes we need to protest and say, no, that is not okay. I get that. And there is more effectiveness in working collaboratively with people. And so there's this tension that I feel that both of those things are true. So let's talk about justice. Yeah, at this point, I'd love to just like take about an hour and dissect what we mean when we talk about justice. For us, we talk about primary versus secondary. Primary justice, I would define as people get what they need in order to thrive. Secondary justice is what happens in order to balance the scales when a harm has happened. And so if we talk about primary justice being what we're hoping to establish in our school settings, one of the things that we have to have conversations about is power. And I went to a session yesterday on power and privilege, and I think we need to keep exploring where privilege shows up, right? Because there's a certain amount of power that happens in those places. But another part of justice is interrupting injustice. It's not enough to just say, I want to promote justice. Sometimes when we see things that are absolutely unjust, we have to stop that. We have to, like, protest. And I saw this yesterday when there were people here preaching hate towards LGBTQIA folks, right? And what was that hate met with? Like the choir. Is anybody here that was in the choir that was here yesterday? Because that was lovely. Like people gathering around and just singing songs. We have to interrupt the injustice. And sometimes that's necessary. Justice can happen at an interpersonal level and an intrapersonal level, but it can also happen at the community level. It can happen economically. And the speaker before talked to us about structural injustice, places where racism is so embedded in our schools and our criminal justice system, in our housing and our economics, that white people benefit from in ways that people of color don't. And so structural injustices show up as well. So injustice and justice look like a lot of different things. Lord have mercy. There it is. Also, equity. Let's talk about equity just a second. Is there a problem? Yeah. Do you need me to slow down? I talk very fast. And I'm trying to slow down every now and then I get excited. Equity. So again, coming back to that Sullivan and Tift quote there, that when our needs are met, that we thrive. We develop our potential. You've seen this commercial, this cartoon? Has anybody seen this cartoon? Can you see it? You got all the animals there. And so the idea is that we're going to have fairness, which means that everybody has to be treated the same. And that's not equity. Maybe you've seen this picture, the equality versus equity. Equality means everybody gets the same thing. But equity, people get what they need in order to be able to participate. I want to push us just a little bit far in our social justice work and say this is a better option even still. Like we actually take down the fence. So let me go back. So this one, there's a fence, you see, that keeps people from being able to see the game, and the little kid in the purple shirt can't participate. And so we give him 2 boxes instead so he can see, he can participate. In this one, we actually get rid of the fence. And that's what we mean when we talk about tearing down those structural things, the pieces of inequity that are built into our systems. How do we tear those down? And so restorative justice at its core is going to promote justice and equity in our schools and our classrooms. And if we're not doing that, we can't really say we're doing restorative justice. So what does that look like? Let's do some examples. So I contacted a whole bunch of my teacher friends. Like I said, I learned everything from teachers. And I said, what does it look like to have just and equitable school settings? And they sent me a ton of really practical, everyday things that we would see in schools and classrooms. And I want to share a couple of those with you this morning. Oops, that one. This right here is a centerpiece for a restorative justice circle process that we did. I'm teaching a class on circle processes to teachers, and I had a teacher who was a special ed teacher, and she says, I have 2 students who don't speak. How do they participate in a circle process? And so she and I played around with ideas, and we came up with a silent circle that's all art-based. And it was so lovely. So what you see there is the prompts that were written out on paper. And then there were all kinds of art supplies. And as we passed the talking piece around the circle, each person was able to contribute to this art project. And we went round and round until everybody was happy with this thing that we have here in the middle. And I wish I could blow it up and show it to you. But it's a paper sculpture that everybody participated in. And it was one of the ways that we were working together to say, what does restorative justice look like for somebody who doesn't speak? How do you have a talking circle if somebody's not talking? Can we do silent circles? Likewise, can we do circle process that we don't require people to sit down for students who need to move and for lots of different needs? And so exploring, I'm a special ed teacher, that's my background, and I worked with kids who had all kinds of struggles in classrooms, whether those were cognitive struggles or emotional or behavioral struggles. So how do we welcome all students to those spaces? Racial justice. Let's talk just about that for a second. Again, I wish you could have been here for the speaker before. I do, because she spoke so broadly about all of the ways that racial injustice shows up in schools and classrooms. And I just want to take a moment and talk about the School-to-Prison Pipeline and the ways in which students of color are suspended and expelled in rates 3, 4, 5 times higher than their white counterparts. These are things that have to change, and they're built into our system, and we have to address them. And here's where it gets wordy. And I wish I could just give you a handout, and if I had thought ahead of time, I would. But let's just take a moment and talk about some of these. In schools, are there places where conversations about justice, equity, and social issues are taking place? And here's what I'm noticing. There's a whole lot of students here, so I want to get y'all involved. If this is true in your school, can you nod? Like, if there are places in your school where this is actually happening, like, give a sign. You could raise your hand or smile or nod your head. What about the second one? The curriculum actually takes into consideration the human rights of those being studied. For example, we don't talk about westward expansion. We actually talk about colonization, right? And we don't talk about forced migration. We actually name it slavery. The picture there on the side is a history textbook, and this happened in Texas, where they were whitewashing a lot of history, right? So is our curriculum representative of everyone's history or just some people's history? Are we including texts from everybody's backgrounds and experiences, or just those of the majority? The third one there. Instruction is presented in ways that meets the needs of all students. I'm up here lecturing, and I'm very aware that many people are not strong auditory learners. And it just crazy makes me nuts, right? Because this is not the way I prefer to talk about restorative justice. Much rather have y'all in small groups around tables talking about these ideas. This is not good pedagogy. Just know that. Student differences aren't just tolerated, but they're embraced and celebrated, all of those differences. Teachers use inclusive language to talk about students' families. In other words, we're not saying go home and talk to your mom and dad. Has anybody ever heard that in your school or classroom? Like a teacher say, go home and talk to your mom and dad? Like, that's harmful. It hurts, especially if you don't have a mom and dad. And that's not just for kids who have 2 moms or 2 dads. That's for kids who grow up in single-parent families or in a foster situation. Like, we have to be more inclusive in the language that we use to talk about families. a friend of mine is a sixth grade teacher, and she uses the term, go home and talk to your grown-ups. She figured every kid has a grown-up that they live with, right? So he uses that all-encompassing term, go home, talk to your grown-ups. Second bullet there, at least there's one gender-neutral bathroom in a school. And again, y'all, that was a hard fight. I wish I could tell you the whole story of how that all transpired, but it was a hard fight to get those bathroom signs changed at Eastern Mennonite. Teachers push back on stereotypes in the professions. And so, like, naming female scientists, naming queer authors, naming African American poets, like being explicit about our curriculum and against the stereotypes that we hold. Think about posters in your school, in the hallways, in the classroom. Do they reflect the diversity in your school? Yeah? Okay, cool, good. Some of you are nodding your head. Some of you are like, there are no posters in my school. My school is boring, white walls. I had a teacher, a student teacher once who quit student teaching the third weekend because she couldn't stand the cinder block walls. She was an artist and she just couldn't stand it. Decided I couldn't do that every day. Well, adults engaged in professional development around diversity. Like, is there a safe zone training in your school where all of the teachers learn about using the right pronouns, using good terminology to talk about students? Are there circle processes specifically for LGBTQIAP+ youth so that they find safe spaces to come together and build community? Yeah? Some of you are really nodding your head on a lot of these, and I want to know, yeah, what school is that? That's awesome. Let's learn. And then, are there circle processes also for young people who are still on a journey to figuring out what tolerance and inclusion looks like? And sometimes those don't happen in the same place, right? Just keep going. Students and school personnel, as well as policies and procedures, demonstrate respect and dignity for all students. Do you feel like the policies, your discipline policies at school, your dress codes, all of those things, do they make your school a great learning space for you? How about books, the curriculum, your library? If you go to your school library, can you find books about same-sex couples that affirm and positively portray LGBTQIAP+ youth in positive light? Cool. That does not happen in my library. We got long work to do. Existence of students clubs, and I see those here, and I've talked to a bunch of people at Laramie in this community, and I see that there's a lot of that going on, so yay, keep that work up. This is the last page. Do students know that if they're experiencing conflict or bullying, that there's someone there to support them and to intervene? Now, I'm going to say let's intervene with a restorative process, and here's why. Because I believe that restorative processes actually create space for addressing the underlying needs and not just punishing the person who's doing the bullying. Because I don't think that actually helps. I just don't. Like, if I've got, well, if I have a student in my classroom who is a bully, and I punish him, kick him out, that solves the problem temporarily. But it's not a long-term sustainable change. What happened? It's not a long-term sustainable change. And so how do we create long-term sustainable change? And I think a lot of that goes back to that principle of conflict is a teaching opportunity. Now, here's what I'm not asking you to do. If you're the person being bullied, I'm not asking you to sit down with the bully person, the person doing the bullying, and have a conference. That might happen. Probably that's not our first step. Okay, so secondly, discipline and academic data suggest that there is proportional representation for all students. So if I go back to race, for example, if we look in our gifted classes, Oftentimes, our gifted classes will be very disproportionately white, middle class, straight, and our remedial classes will be disproportionately students of color, students who come from different economic backgrounds, and students who don't conform, maybe, to the societal norms of the school. And so that's an audit that we should all do in our schools. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. This is the last one. So in conclusion, I just want to name a few things to summarize. One, teachers rock. Teachers have a huge, huge responsibility in the classroom, and some of them are showing up the best way they know how with way lack of resources, and they're not going to always be perfect. So we want to have grace for them, right? They also have needs that aren't getting met in schools and classrooms. They are also not experiencing autonomy because someone is telling them what to teach and when to teach it and all that, right? So I think that there's something to acknowledge there. So be really cool with your teachers, love them, and teachers, like, continue to give yourselves, like, grace. I love y'all. Seriously, I work my life off. To support y'all. Secondly, understanding justice in schools is not a one and done check mark. We can't just check it off a box and say, okay, we did that diversity training, we're done. This is an ongoing process that we're constantly working on. Third, do your homework. Read, learn, grow. I made a commitment during 2017 that I was going to read 12 books, one a month, by people of color. And that was a commitment that I made to make sure that I'm not just reading white authors, that I'm actually reading authors who speak about education. And so one of the things that I did in my classroom, and I teach a course for teachers on how people learn, a learning motivation and assessment. It's an educational psychology course. Do you know that not one textbook in that field is written by a person of color? Not one. So you know what I did? I threw out the textbook. So we're not going to use a textbook that's written by white people about how people of color learn. I'm so sorry. It's just not going to happen. And so we threw out the textbook, and now I use primary texts from lots of folks. And I love it. It's so much great because get to bring in authors who've written about how students learn from all kinds of backgrounds. So I don't know if you know S.J. Miller or not, but S.J. Miller is one of my heroes. S.J. is a trans guy who writes so much about critical literacy and how people learn to read and about literature. And so he gets to be a primary author in my class because I got rid of the textbook, because the textbook wasn't representative of the students that I want my teachers to teach. So do our homework. We have to read. We have to expand our understanding. And then hear more voices. Pay attention to who's not speaking into a space. Yeah. And I'll just acknowledge that, again, I'm a white person. And I'm talking about restorative justice. So I want to own that and be really humble. And secondly, I think we have to challenge our histories. I just think that's essential. The way we talk about American history, U.S. history, is just atrocious. I'm sorry, it just is. We have to do better. And like the way we talk about queer history, like it's not even in there. Like nobody's talking about LGBTQIAP+ history in our schools. It's just not, I mean, if it's happening in your school, great, but I haven't been in a school where they're doing a great job talking about queer history, much less racial history. So we have to do better in those things. Yeah. The last thing I want to throw out and say, shameless plug for EMU. I love my university. It's not a perfect university by any means. But if you're looking for a college that promotes restorative justice, that promotes justice and equity, I think we're at least promoting that. Like, it's at least our intention. It's our aim. And so I'd love to talk to you about coming and studying education or anything at EMU. We have a conference in the summer, a 2-day conference, a restorative justice and education conference, June 25th and 26th. I'd invite you to. Yeah, so that's it. I forgot forgot the slide on Newton. So Newton's first law of motion says that an object going in a particular direction stays going in that particular direction unless a force is operated on it, unless something interferes with that, right? And I would like to say that about some of the justice work that we need to do. Things are going in a particular direction because it makes sense to a certain population for them to go in that direction. And it will continue to go in that direction unless we do something. And how many of y'all were here last night to hear Judy Shepard? Yeah, right? So like one of the things that she talked about was get out there and vote. So if you're 18 or older, get out there and vote. If you're not, still promote the vote and be active, get engaged. So keep moving. I'd love to answer questions. Do we have time?
Yeah, we have a few minutes. Who would, I have a mic if. Oh, thanks.
Hi, I'm Jana, and I've come to a lot of these things. I've learned so much. I graduated in '93, and there was one guy in the Greek system that was considered bisexual. He was the only one I knew on campus, one professor. So when the Matthew Shepard story came out, it was huge all over the world, and people were just, the state of Wyoming is so conservative, the people were very closed-minded and very open-minded. You were talking about how acceptance, they had the angels, and they had all these people with hate around them. So I think there's a lot of messages from Matthew Shepard's story that came out, and I think the Wyoming as itself is one of the first states to allow women to vote. So we say that we're conservative, but we allow things to happen in our state that are radical. And Matthew Shepard's story was pretty radical as far as being killed for being gay. There's not a lot of people coming out in the media talking about abuse, and so I'm going to be a teacher hopefully in the future, and I'm thinking about these kids that I worked with in the inner cities who wear their pants down below their bottom. They're not in prison. And I don't really know the culture of that, but I do know that there are mixed messages where they're saying that they're owned by gay people. And there's a lot of hate that gay people put out there too, and a lot of mixed messages that they give. And I think these kind of topics and all that kind of stuff is very important because of the messages that are given out in the public and all the hate that's given, but also you have to look at the gay people as a culture and how they treat others, because I see both sides to it. I hope you understand that. So if I have a heterosexual student being harassed by gay students, I want to also address that, because there is a culture where you can't talk against gay people, or you can't say anything against them, or you're prejudiced. And I think you have to really address both issues. That's all.
I appreciate your statement, and I think one of the things that I'll bring us back to restorative justice is that mutual concern, or there is a respect and a dignity and a mutual concern for all students. And so I think in a restorative justice culture, of course we would address harassment by anyone, for anyone. And we would address the particularly egregious nature of the harassment that LGBTQ folks experience, because there aren't protections in place. So I appreciate the comment there. I also want to just note about conservative and liberal spaces. I don't think there are conservative states and red states, blue states. I know that exists. There are pockets of beautiful, wonderful people on all spectrums politically who are lovely, kind, amazing human beings who treat people with respect and dignity. And so while things can get political, I don't think that that's a state-to-state basis. I think that's a very contextual place. I want to just honor that people all over the place are beautiful and wonderful and doing really good social justice work. We have about 2 minutes. Yeah.
So I'm a student over in Cheyenne East, and I was just kind of wondering what your advice would be towards students who want to be able to help others kind of get more social justice, like you were talking.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would do is really push. Make sure that there's a gay-straight alliance, make sure that there are other student organizations. Students have so much agency, so much power that's untapped often. And so using your voice and your perspective to create spaces, I think is a really beautiful first step. If you already have some organizations like that, the more people that are involved in that, the more momentum you get. Those bathroom signs at EMU changed, not because I went and pulled them down, but because there were a whole lot of students and faculty that were supporting that move. And so I would just say, build momentum, build community, and keep being an ally. Listen well. If you're a straight identified person, listen well to your friends who are identifying as LGBTQIAP+. What do they need? And letting them kind of guide your work so that you're not jumping in and doing things that maybe don't need to happen, but really working collaboratively. Thanks for that question. Cool. Yeah.
At my school in Laramie High, so I go here to Laramie High. We have, so it's mandatory to take a modern American studies class, but like if you want to learn history of Africa, Latin American history, it has to be an elective. Like how was it that you were able to like take, the book that you were talking about and just throw it away and use primary sources and stuff? Like, how would I be able to do that at my school if it's just an elective? Because I understand that like U.S. history is important because like you should know about like what happened in your country and everything, but I just kind of feel like it really takes away from like other cultures too.
Sure, I appreciate that, and you're right. I teach at a college, so that helps. I get to choose my own textbook. A lot of high school teachers don't get to choose their own textbooks. And so what I encourage my students who are studying to be teachers, what I encourage them to do is use the textbook that you have to use and supplement it with other materials. And push back. Like if you see a section in the history textbook, the U.S. history textbook, that doesn't include the perspectives of African Americans or Latinx people, like pull in other resources to teach that. So it's not an elective course. It actually is part of our U.S. history. So yes. Does that answer your question? Yeah, because sometimes teachers don't have that choice. They can't just throw out the textbook. In fact, very rarely can they do that. So yeah. I'm excited that you have an elective though. Yeah, that's a step in the right direction even. We didn't have an elective when I was growing up. Yeah, good. I think our time is about up, but hey, I just want to say a word to all of you high school students. Or is it just high school or are there middle school students too? Middle school? Love, love, love. Y'all are my heroes. And when I talk about teachers doing the good work every day, y'all are doing the good work too. And I can't even imagine going back and being 13 again. It would make me cry. But keep plugging. Y'all are amazing. And the fact that you keep showing up and keep doing this work is just humbling to me. So thank you. Can we give them a round of applause?
Great, thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
And books over here. Thanks.